Thanks, everybody. Thanks for showing up. I'm Fritz Zimmerman. I'm the author of two books, The Nephilim Chronicles, Fallen Angels in the Ohio Valley, and The Nephilim Chronicles, A Travel Guide to the Ancient Ruins in the Ohio Valley. I'll talk more about that in a second. What we're going to be talking about, ancient mysteries of North America, some history that you probably have not read nor ever heard about. And with that, let's get started on these slides. What we're going to be talking about is two topics that I cover at much greater length in the book. It's the Neanderthal hybrids in the Great Lakes region, and then the Amorites of the Bible fame that made their way into the Ohio Valley, and hopefully give you enough evidence here in the next hour to at least give you a taste of what I'm covering in the books. This is the first book, Fallen Angels in the Ohio Valley, that has over 300 accounts of giant skeletons that they have found in North America, Great Britain, and the ancient Levant, and their ties to the topics that we've already talked about. That was accumulation of going through about 10,000 different histories at the Fort Wayne Genealogical Library, that I happened to be lucky enough to live in Fort Wayne and had access to the largest genealogical collection in the United States, meaning no matter where you lived in the greater U.S., I probably had access to your county histories, state histories, township histories. So the list that I came up with could only been derived from the library that I had access to in my town. And then that's followed up by the travel guide, and that is the culmination of actually exploring over 700 mound and earthwork sites in Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Michigan. And of those 700 sites, it took 13 years of field work done primarily in the winter months. I have 222 that were photographed, and I have directions to those in this travel guide. So it's unprecedented, the amount of earthworks that are still out there and available for you to go see, with probably 90% of those being on public ground that you can have access to and explore. So the first thing we'll talk about is the hunters and fishers in the Great Lakes, and then the giant human remains that were found there. And around the 1800s and the early 1900s, there were plenty of newspaper reports all across the country of them discovering these giant skeletons. This particular one was in Oregon, another in Pittsburgh. This is one that was found on the Georgia coast, giant skeleton. This is over in the Gulf of Mexico, which is interesting because what's so hard to find is actual skeletal remains or photos of skeletal remains. And this particular newspaper article actually had one large skull, which you can see, and then two that are next to it. But just to give you an idea that the size of some of the skulls. Ohio, giant skeletons. And in some of the skeletal remains, they mention missing link, meaning that the skeletal remains that they found, or the skull types that they found, had archaic type qualities of protruding brow ridge, sloping foreheads, thick skull walls, and everything that could be most closely associated with Neanderthal, or definitely a primitive archaic type skull. So who are these guys? Now we'll get into that. Well, it turns out that unlike what most archaeologists like to proclaim as the sole reason that the United States and North America and eventually South America was populated, which was the Beringia theory, that meaning that everyone that came to the United States walked here over the Beringia land bridge that is current day Alaska and then going over into Russia during the end of the last ice age when that corridor was open. However, Other researchers, this particular one being Gimbutas, who's the foremost authority in Europe, believe that there were subsequent migrations by hunters and fishers or maritime people, in which he says, here, in a broad sense, the culture of northeastern Europe in the hunting fishing stage is counterpart to the Eurasian culture, which stretched across the whole forest zone, northern Europe, Asia, to North America. And I think it's important to know that if you go across those northern latitudes around 65 degrees, you're going to find the same type of terrain that is going to be full of lakes, water, and so wherever these people went, they didn't have to adapt to a new climate or to a different environment. So whatever tools that they were using at the time could be readily used to whatever new areas that they went to. And the photo that we're showing here is artifacts here are from Sweden, and these here are from Maine. And we're going to find a similar or almost identical material culture wherever we go across the globe associated with these people. And these particular things, called plummets, are also found everywhere within the extent of the northern regions of the globe. Burial types across this entire region, very much the same. We're not going to get into too much of that, but wherever we would go, we would find burial pits, red ochre, strange things like they would bury somebody and then they would build a fire on top of the grave. And many times dogs were included within the grave sites, particularly with children, the reason being that the dog was placed in there to protect the young child in death as it did in life. And then some of the artifacts that are found that are also similar. Now they've done some digs over in Europe. This particular is a glacial cane. This type of burial is a little more prevalent where I'm from in northern Indiana, southern Michigan, to some extent into the northern regions of Ohio. These glacial canes were, of course, made by the glacier, so it was this glacial till as they were melting, but many burial types are found within them, especially if they have kind of a conical look to them. This particular one being over in Denmark, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that when they did this dig, they described the skeletal remains as showing many primitive characteristics, heavy facial features with prominent brow ridge, relatively low-set eye sockets, typical of the Cro-Magnon race. And then they said that these were remote cousins to Cro-Magnon. Well, 4100 BC, you have to realize that the archaeological line is that Cro-Magnon had completely disappeared by 10,000 BC. So to say remote cousins is really all that was left, because archaeologists have really boxed themselves in as far as identifying them anything other than Homo sapiens with archaic type traits. These types of skeletal remains have been found all over northern Europe. This is a particular one is associated with the Turrbal culture, which were hunters and fishers and a maritime people. And again, this particular skull was described as large and massive with protruding brow ridge, sloping forehead, heavy mandible that is characteristic, again, of the Cro-Magnon race. Over in Russia, another find. However, in this case, and this was done by archaeologists of the USSR, they believed in this particular skull, which was of this young child, that they found both Neanderthal traits and modern human traits, and their conclusion was that this wasn't just an archaic type skull or skeleton, but it was a hybrid that Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal had interbred. Of course, this has been dismissed and is currently dismissed by most archaeologists who believe in what's called the replacement theory, meaning that there was Neanderthal, and as Cro-Magnon moved up to the north, they replaced them, but never interbred with the Neanderthals, and either Neanderthals moved and died out or were killed by Cro-Magnon, but never was the fact that they interbred ever introduced into the paradigm of history. A particular skull that they found in northern Russia on a lake in a burial that included the red ochre and many of the burial procedures that we had shown earlier. This skull, if I can get this. Oh, there we go. This particular skull, you can see that there is no forehead. You have a thick brow ridge here. These little things are part of a beaver hat. But you can see the sloping forehead, the archaic type qualities. However, Neanderthal didn't have a chin. But what's interesting about this particular skull is this right here, which is called the mental foramen. And the people that did this study, which is the migration of the mental foramen in Neanderthals and modern humans, which is part of the Journal of Human Evolution, I'm sure you all read this, that this hole here in Neanderthals was in M1, which means it was over here on the side where your molar is. And in modern humans, and you can probably feel it on your own chin, modern humans, it's in the front. So in this particular skull, we can see it on the side. So not only do we have the brow ridge and the protruding or the sloping skull, which would be more Neanderthal, we also have the mental foramen, which is showing that this particular skull had characteristics more related to Neanderthal. Now, just recently, some archaeologists with recent finds at Denisovan Cave in northern Russia and also on the island of Florensis that were displaying so many of the Neanderthal qualities that interbreeding did take place. And so there is a small group of anthropologists and archaeologists that are now saying that Neanderthal wasn't a separate species, but is actually could be considered part of Homo sapiens, and then now reclassifying those as Homo sapien neanderthalensis. So now they are becoming part of Homo sapien. So that's where we're coming slowly in this line of research. And this is a skull type that was found in northern Russia. And again, you can see the brow ridge, the lack of a skull, and the jutting upper jaw that's more characteristic of the Neanderthal species. Gimbutas, in talking about the skull that was on Olin Island, his take on that was, of course, that it was archaic, but as far as a racial identity to this, he said that Cro-Magnon consisted of both Caucasoid and Mongoloid traits. So it wasn't a Caucasian and certainly wasn't Oriental, but it was a hybrid race that was being created by this fusion of these two species. And what he said of those, that it was similar to Ladogan type of skull, which they have in northern Germany, and this is what someone would look like. And eventually what we're going to get to is the genesis of what we know as some of the Native Americans. Races of Europe, Stephen Kuhn said of some of these skull types that were bearing a lot of upper Paleolithic type qualities is that they most resembled North American Plains Indians. And this particular bust, I don't think anyone could discount how much that looks like a Plains Indian, a Sioux Indian. However, it's not. That's actually a bust of Cro-Magnon. I'm just giving you an idea of how close we're talking about as far as what these people might have looked like. And this is, if we say someone has an archaic type skull, then these are the four characteristics that in any number of probably 3 or 4 that we would look at to identify them: of sloping forehead, protruding brow ridge, massive jaws, thick skull walls, all of these characteristics being described in many of the skeletal remains that they find in the northern regions of the United States. Now, when we look at the skeletal remains here in the U.S., not only do we find them on the west coast and the coastal regions, but on the east coast, they land here in the extreme northeast. And any population, if you were going to believe in the Beringia theory, no one moves to Labrador. No one moves to Nova Scotia. It seems like a reasonable place where you might end up, much like they would, thousands of years later when this country was being discovered by the Europeans. But the oldest remains in this country are up into this region. And the oldest burial mound, or one of the oldest burial mounds, is up in Labrador that dates 5500 BC, which gives you an idea of the age of, at least the age of the act of actually constructing a burial mound over their dead, and the rituals that were involved in that. The types of burials associated, this is a burial mound in Croton Dam, Michigan, which is pretty much straight across the lake from where we're at right now. But we do have a burial mound, and what's of interest here is that everything within the burial mound is more closely associated with the maritime people. And that would be the beaver incisors, the copper needles, but more so the child's burial accompanied by the dog. And this is separate from the later woodland cultures that didn't practice this. And it gives you an idea that this region in Michigan and this region here in Wisconsin was populated at an early date by these maritime people. Some evidence of that, this is the county that I grew up in, northeast Indiana, DeKalb County. There was a guy named Cameron Parks, and he kept finding artifacts that were made of slate. Of course, kind of a strange kind of arrowhead, being made of slate opposed to a chert. But when he kept finding these slate artifacts, after looking in a book, he realized that really what he was looking at is artifacts that were identical to the maritime culture associated in the northeast.
Excuse me, where is that?
DeKalb County.
Okay.
DeKalb County is the northeast corner of Indiana.
Okay.
And these following are some of these archaic skeletal types that they have found. This particular one was up in Branch County, Michigan, which is southern Michigan, not too far up the Indiana line. But red paint was associated with the burial. But of interest is the fact that this particular one had 2 rows of teeth. And also what's interesting is that this was no abnormality of 1 in a million, because the writer of this in a scientific paper also said reports of large skeletons and unusual tooth arrangement seems to be common with this type of find. So this was not an isolated case, but something that they were finding a lot of. And if we look at the skull, we can see the protruding brow ridge, we can see the slope, the jaw is missing, but still what we do have here appears to be more of an archaic type skull. Now, if we go across over into Oregon, and we have reports in California, if we're going to believe that what we have is a circumpolar people, then whatever we find on the east, we should find on the west. That they could have come independently, but they should show the same type of not only burial characteristics, but also the skeletal remains should be similar. This particular one is some gigantic skeletons that they found in Oregon and described as primitive men, forehead sloping directly back from the eyes, and 2 rows of teeth. And we can see just from this skeleton, we can see the protruding brow ridge, we can see this massive jaw that's associated with this primitive skull. We'll go back across over into New York, and again we're going to find the same thing. We got 2 rows of teeth. Singular peculiarity, the broad flat jaws, which is much like what we looked in the last slide. Retreating forehead, great prominence of the occiput, which was common with these skulls. So again, common, that we're not looking at an isolated case. We're not looking at some sort of genetic abnormality that somebody found, and we're going to attach that to a whole population. This seems to be a common characteristic. Over in LaPorte, Indiana, which you can see is not too far. This is just around the other side of the lake. Another find is made in the county where, again, they're calling it a connecting link between mankind and his less favored brother, the ape. So again, they're finding this archaic type skull with a sloping forehead, and many of these researchers really didn't know what to make of it. However, they didn't have the information that there were other finds being made all over the country. Again, we're back in California, showing archaic type skulls and everyone being baffled of what they were finding. A little bit closer to home here, Lake County. Of course, I'm sure most of you are familiar with that on your way to Chicago. That's the first county you're going to hit in Illinois. But again, being described, skull, large projecting eyebrows, deep eye sockets, low receding foreheads, and again, describing it as the missing link. And I wanted to put these in here because I'm not sure, but I'm sure most of you are from Wisconsin or really close to this area. But these were found in your state also. And you know how many lakes are around here. So this would be a reasonable place for these people to settle and to continue doing whatever from wherever they came without any disruption as far as material culture or how they were living. And again, dry spot, large human skeletons, all of large size, and describing the underjaw, but large skeletons around this area. Here's a newspaper headline from Stoddard: remains of giant aborigines discovered. No real description of course, of the skulls on this, but they did find big skeletons. Another one here around Fond du Lac. This one happened to be found in a mound and measuring about 7 feet. Yet another one were large, but then in this one here, again, jawbones are long and pointed, bearing a minute resemblance to the head of a monkey. Same skull type found here in Wisconsin. And this is probably the best evidence. These are skulls from Wisconsin. And we can see here from this that the guy has the protruding brow ridge, very little skull. Notice here this mental foramen, how it's here under M1, which is more of a Neanderthal trait. And his lovely wife, who's over here, she has a Neanderthal trait of not having a chin. The chin was a modern development in Homo sapiens, but she seems to lack one. He doesn't, but he also has the facial prognathicism that is also associated with archaic type skulls. There is some evidence of this Cro Magnon Neanderthal, or at least a Cro Magnon that had followed the Native Americans over here, and that is a genetic marker called haplo-X. Now, it's interesting that it shows up in Indian groups that are closely associated with the Great Lakes. And so the Sioux, the Iroquois, the Ojibwa all bear this marker that would be presumed to have come from the hunters and fishers that had migrated over here from Europe or even from the West Coast via Asia, but by boat. Identifying the later or prototypes of what later would be the Native American groups of the Sioux and Iroquois, Cherokee, etc. We know that archaeologists don't believe in any kind of maritime diffusion or anything other than that of the Beringia theory. But what's interesting is that I found this quote from the leading archaeologist in the 50s. His name was Spalding, who said of the Laurentian complex, or Point Peninsula we can directly follow a line down to the later Iroquois people. But what he said is the ultimate origin of the Laurentian complex, or Point Peninsula, need not concern us here, but surely in some sense is representative of the European, Siberian, North American cultural tradition of the boreal forest zone. Of course, the boreal forest zone is these northern regions. So in some sense, he's admitting it. He's admitting that there was a maritime people that had come over here, and these people were representative of that, and not that of the Beringia. And Sioux and Iroquois, their legends all believe too that their origins was from the Northeast, and it also included living by a sea and being more of a sea-type people. So Native American heritage and legends believe that. When we look at the cultural group of the Cherokee and Iroquois, and to some extent the Sioux, we know through linguistic studies that about 3,500 years ago or 1500 BC that these people split into the respective groups of the tribes that we know today. And eventually, these would become the mound builders known as the Great Hopewell, the Hopewell mounds that are found here in Wisconsin with your effigy mounds, and then those be associated with the Winnebago Sioux, and then of course the Sioux groups in the Ohio Valley that made up what we know today as the Hopewell. However, this is what we're left in modern archaeology and how this has all been subdivided, and we're not talking about a people or that, but it's an interaction sphere, as archaeologists like to call it, meaning that there's no relation, and really all we're looking at when we look at Hopewell or we talk about Hopewell is a people within a trade group, but not being necessarily related, and certainly not an empire. But subdivided like this, and you can see these are the Ohio Hopewell. This would be more of where we normally see the Iroquois. They've completely left this out, but the traditional lands of the Cherokee. But we do know at one time they were all together in one people. So after archaeologists over the last 100 years have obliterated thousands of burial mounds across the United States, they still have not answered who were the Hopewell, where did they come from, or where they went. That's where we're at. So when an archaeologist digs into a mound or does an excavation, know that it's more about getting a grant, and they have no intention of really finding out anything about anybody because of the Native American Graves Protection Act of 1993, which said it was illegal for anyone, including an archaeologist, to dig into any mound of a known tribe. So as long as they call them Hopewell, Yungi phase, this focus, that phase, whatever they want to call it, as long as they don't call it Iroquois, Cherokee, or Sioux, they can continue to dig. So it behooves them to ever put this information together and identify these tribes as who they really are. Despite the Sioux who have numerous legends that they once occupied the Ohio Valley. They left, but there's report after report and legend after legend that they once lived here in the Ohio Valley, which I guess is not here. If I was here, it would be talking back home. And I'm going to go into all these slides, but there's just numerous accounts of their legends of living in this area. So if we were really going to look at who these people are that consisted of the Hopewell and these maritime people, it would be in the respected lands that we would know later historically of where they were. And that's the Iroquois up around the Great Lakes, the Sioux in the Ohio Valley. However, the Sioux wrapped around Lake Michigan on the western end where we're at right now. And so Winnebago, who was noted as one of the most ancient tribes of the Sioux people who lived in this area and were the authors of many of the effigy mounds around Wisconsin, and then of course the Cherokee Indians in the southeast. which kind of takes us to part 2 of the talk, and we'll get into the next migration, which is the Amorites coming over here. And I think it's important to note that the corded ware people, or also known as the Beaker people, who would inevitably build Stonehenge, came up through Europe as traders of metals, and that they dealt in the same areas, or pushed into the same areas as these hunters and fishers, and it probably at some time had come across the fact that there was copper over here in the U.S. But at one time, these people touched base. So around 2700 BC, they come up there. They're still, the megalithic culture is on its way out. However, it's still a little bit left, and that would explain why there's a few cases up in Labrador region where we find megalithic remains of mounds with doorway lintels on them and standing stones. And there's not a lot of megalithic remains, but certainly enough to indicate that there was some sort of contact with megalithic people. But the next group of people that we'll talk about briefly are the Amorites. And the Amorites, much like the hunters and fishers, have their roots in the Cro Magnon people, who were noted for their large size and who are described as having high foreheads, but prominent brow ridge, but being characteristic of the Cro Magnon people, who were tall. There's many cases of Cro Magnon remains being found that are 6'7", 6'8". In one instance, there was a family where the oldest man was about 6'8", his wife was 6'2", 6'3", and the child that was with them, which was a young man, was 6'3". So we have a whole family of large people, but it's not isolated that many of the Cro Magnon remains were large. And reports of these are also found within newspaper headlines. Some of the descriptions of those, and again we're going to find that same type of skull where they say the shape of the skull is remarkable, the forehead is low, sockets of the eyes are square, prominent jaws. So the actual skull types, skeletal types of these people is not that much different than what we're going to find with the early hunters and fishers. And this is it. The man was 6'6", woman was 6 feet, and the youth was 6'2", but plenty of documentation of large Cro Magnon people. Most of us, probably our first introduction to large people is in the Bible with the accounted giants. Probably the most notorious of those being the Amorites, who lived on the Mediterranean. Same people that Moses encountered and spoken of in the Bible, of a people described as men of great stature, and then in Numbers again saying they were giants, and the Hebrews were grasshoppers in comparison. And also over in the biblical lands, what you generally don't see on a documentary is all of the megalithic remains that were in the ancient Levant. And we see some indication of that in the Bible, that when we read of things like Jacob set up a pillar of stone, there's another pillar here, that these pillars are related to the megalithic culture, and it was a megalithic culture that certainly was influencing the early Hebrews. This is a stone circle called Og Circle in the Golan Heights. And again, in Kings, when he takes 12 stones, according to the number of tribes of sons of Jacob, he makes a stone circle, 12, and how that might be related to a solar circle. But these circles are found in the biblical regions. Dolmans, there were thousands of these dolmens found around the Jordan River. And a dolmen is the burial chamber and what's left of a burial mound. Erosion seems to be a little more prominent over in these lands, and so what you're left with is just the stone. But these stones are comparable also what you would find in England and many places around the globe, generally associated or close to coastlines. This is a burial mound with a circle around it in Syria. This would have been an Amorite grave, and this symbolism will become dolmens, stone avenues, again, megalithic remains that are found around the biblical lands. There's a lot more in the book of what they found around there. Just touch on this a little bit because this is in the Bible. Of Genesis 6:4 is what most people are most familiar with. That it came to pass that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, they're beautiful, took them, and these would become the race of giants. And we'll discover just exactly who these people were. Genesis 6:4 is elaborated a little bit more in the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch used to be in the Bible. When Christ was reading the Bible, the book of Enoch was in it. However, the Bible has been edited over the years and books taken out. But I think the important thing to realize is that what we're looking at in this story is the advent of the Bronze Age. So this in the book of Enoch is really a laundry list of what we're going to find in Stonehenge, what we're eventually going to find in the Ohio Valley, and that is the art of making metals. Of course, that is the combination of copper and tin to make bronze. Astrology. Of course, we know Stonehenge was built to track the sun and the moon and the constellations. Shamaziel, the signs of the sun. Serial, the course of the moon. So when we look at stone circles, we look at things like Stonehenge, we look at the hinges in the Ohio Valley. This is just a laundry list of the knowledge that the sons taught these people, but it all plays out within the megalithic remains. And that's what they're talking about. Also interesting is the relationship of these sons of God in the Bible and how that is revealed in several quotes. In Genesis, Abraham cannot take the promised land. Why? Because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. This is the covenant that God had with the Amorites, who were the offspring of the sons of God. And we can look at another quote, and this was in Ezekiel and the judgment of the king of Tyre. Now, the king of Tyre, of course, Tyre is on the Mediterranean coast. This is an Amorite city. And it says of this king, "Thou hast been in the Eden, the garden of God, in the day thou was created. Thou was on the holy mountain. Thou was perfect in thy ways when thou was created." Until there's that word again, iniquity was found in thee. So they're talking about the Amorites who controlled Tyre, but also that they were created. Now, if we look at Cro-Magnon and we look at evolution, who is before Cro-Magnon? Well, nobody. That's the missing link. So if you want to look at this in a religious context, then there shouldn't be any confrontation with what you currently believe. But that may be an indication of who was Adam. Adam was Cro-Magnon. And it would seem to relate to that, since we already know the Amorites were bearing Cro-Magnon traits. And here in this quote, it's identifying who was created, and that was the Amorites. But the Amorites are on the move, they're traders, and they're cutting all the way through Europe, up into England. This is their path. Along the way, they're leaving skeletal remains. These are generic type skulls, which are easily identified by this flattened back of the head. You can see how high this is. It almost looks like a Peruvian type skull. And in the early or mid 1800s, they started finding these type of skulls. These are Peruvian type skulls, and what they thought was that they were finding Peruvian skulls. However, they kept finding them and realized that they were actually identifying a new group of people that they had not yet found before, who inevitably would be known as the Dinarics. One of these skulls was found at the gates of Damascus in Jerusalem, which would correspond with the fact that Jerusalem used to be an Amorite city. We know that mainly from one, the name Jerusalem, which is which means sun or light, city of light, Jerusalem, like the city of from which Abraham came from. But at this gates, they found the skull was unusually large, and it also had the back of the head was flattened. But they did find one of these skulls at the gates of the. Oh, I wanted to point out that the Mount Moriah, of course, in Jerusalem has its root with the Amorites, or Amuru. So that in itself has a root with the Amorites, as it was a former Amorite city. So they're moving along to get through this. The corded people, who were a contingent of 3 separate different peoples, moved through northern Europe, eventually over into England. They were a combination of Borby brachycephalids, sometimes called Borby Cro-Magnon, the corded people, and the eastern Mediterranean Dinaric, bearing certain types of pottery. The pottery on the left is actually pottery associated with the Beaker people, and the one on the right is from Michigan, which was called the tulip design, which was very popular. If you were making pottery, this was the most desired shape that you wanted. As the Dinarics and these people are coming through Europe, they're leaving a mound type that we saw in Syria, and that is a burial mound with a circle around it, which was symbolic of the sun god. But that particular type of mound we can track across Europe all the way into England. One of the skeletal remains of what these people looked like is Church and Man. Swastikas, some other things. This particular guy was 6'6", but if you wanted to see what do these guys look like, is this guy right here. And there's more photos of him on the internet. It was the corded people who have been associated with the Amorites, would be the prototype of the burial mounds in England. This is the landscape of England, showing burial mounds with circles around them, types of hinges, but the general landscape. What's interesting, though, is this also is that these are the prototypes of the burial mounds you would find in the Ohio Valley. Every burial mound type there in England can be found in the Ohio Valley, of course, along with the giant skeletons. This is just a description of a hinge, of exactly what that is. And of course, the most noted hinge is Stonehenge, which is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise. And we see the stones that the Beaker people built. The ditch going around it is much larger. However, the Beaker people, or the Amorites, did adopt that type of sun temple, and they built their hinges of their own. But it's a circular work with an outer wall interior ditch with a gateway that's generally aligned to a solar event. Largest hinge in England is Avebury at 1,250 feet. I guess we have about 15 minutes. But this design here, which is a serpent, here's the head of the serpent, and this probably had its roots in some of the earlier symbolism that you would find in the Middle East. And this slide didn't come out. This is actually Portsmouth, Ohio. But the earthwork at Portsmouth, Ohio, here's the serpent and coming down here, but it's very, very close, almost identical at Portsmouth to what you would find at Avebury. Newark, Ohio. This is the hinge down here. I'm not sure if I have a photo. Yeah, I do. This is the hinge, large hinge, which is aligned to actually the May 1st sunrise. But it also, largest hinge in the Ohio Valley, happens to be the same size as the largest hinge in England, which again is 1,250 feet. The description of the people that invaded England, that were associated with the Beaker people, just short square skull showing great development of superciliary ridges and eyebrows, tall, strongly built, brutal appearance. So we're seeing that same upper Paleolithic type skull types, along with being tall, who are associated with the Beaker People, as we have back in Europe. And this is a corded people. This skull here is from the Ohio Valley, and this one here is actually from Poland. But I just wanted to point out that the chins are identical. This is called facial prognathicism, which is somewhat of an archaic trait where your upper jaw juts out a little bit. Nasal notches be the same. And of course, this ridge here on the top of the forehead is nearly identical. But many of the skeletal remains that we're going to find in the Ohio Valley are going to be identical to what we're going to find in England associated with the Beaker People. This is Borby Cro-Magnon. These two here from the Ohio Valley. This one here is from Denmark. And again, without going into a point-by-point 30-minute dissertation on why these skulls are the same, they're the same. But most striking, because it's such a rare head type, are the Denaric. And this skull here, again, is from Europe. This one here is from the Ohio Valley. Again, we have very similar chins. We have facial prognathicism, nasal notch being nearly identical, and this forehead, somewhat elongated brow ridge also being very close. The degree of the head flattening would vary, so we're not going to pay too much attention to the back of the head, a pronounced mastoid in the back, but identical type skulls and associated with being very large people. So Beaker People developed the henge. That's from around Stonehenge right there. Has anybody here been to Mound State Park in Anderson? You have and have. Can you see any difference in this photo from what you see at Mound State Park, opposed to that stone circle in the middle?
Yeah, the stone circle, and it's very, very similar.
But the general of this is a hinge. Here we have a gateway that's going to.
Stylistically, it's exactly the same.
We have the ditch, we have the outer wall, we have this gateway that's going to be aligned to a solar event. Here in England, they have a stone circle. We're not going to find that in the Ohio Valley, but many of the hinges in England and the British Isles had burial mounds within their center. Some had stone circles. This one particularly had a stone circle, but it's the same type of earthwork being built by the same type of people. And these types of hinges are all over the Ohio Valley, and in the Mound Guide you can go and visit those. This is the hinge in Anderson, Indiana. This is looking down the ditch, but I just wanted to show the size of it. And this outer wall is actually serpentine and was probably more pronounced back in the day and did represent the serpent. This is looking across the gateway here. You're not allowed to go out here in the middle anymore. Archaeologists destroyed the burial mound that was a solar marker for 2,000 years, but they destroyed the burial mound, completely ignorant to its purpose as a solar marker with some surrounding earthworks. More hinges. This one's in Cambridge City. This here is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise. The one to the south is aligned to the equinox. And the burial mounds in Indiana in themselves are aligned, being 20 miles apart, to the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunrise and summer solstice sunset. And it's a good example of ley lines, which we would also find associated with some of the earthworks and burial mounds across the English landscape. And then the last thing I want to talk to you is about numerology. Numerology that is called Gematria, or earth measures, that had its roots with the Amorites who seized Babylon in 1950 BC. They are also the first people to come up with Hammurabi's law codes. A lot of the current laws we have today actually have their roots with the Amorites and when they took Babylon, but they are also the first people to come up with high mathematics. This includes pi, square roots, and modern geometry as we know it. So the development of high math is from this early date, and they incorporated that into a numerical codex where certain numbers had meanings, much like they do today, which 13 is unlucky, and we have some other numbers that have different meanings. Now the core numbers involved in this, I'll move right along. 666 was the number for the sun. 1080 was the number for the moon. 555 was the number for the sacred marriage. 33 and 8. And I'll get a few more specifics on this. This is the Babylonian magic square. What's interesting of this is that each one of these, no matter which way you add this up, it's going to add up to 111. 111, 6 on each side, so no matter how you added this, it's going to get 666. But it was something of them playing around with those numbers and the significance of 111, which we can see and know that they were playing around this, that timesing this of how you get the sequences of numbers. And if you go to this extent, you can go through 1 through 9 and then back to 1 again. But that was the significance of the number 1. The Babylonians, this is their king's list, 432,000 years, which we can break down into 216, divided again down to 1080. The significance of 216 is that it is a sum total of 6 times 6 times 6. And then we get 216, so whenever we see a 216, we know kind of we're talking about the sacred marriage because we have the number 1080 involved and we have the number 666. That's the sacred marriage that was the real principle and essence of ancient religions, where you never wanted all of sun, you never wanted all of earth, you wanted a balance. It was a balance of power. But numbers that do show up in these ancient religions, and what most people don't realize is that in the Bible, these numbers show up. You're all familiar with Revelations, and where it mentions 666. What's interesting is that in the next quote, after mentioning the 666, it is 144,000 people that are going to be saved. And if we divide the 144,000 by 666, this is the number we get. And if you can see that, but it's 216.216.216.216 to infinity. So we have the 666, we have the 216, and of course we have the 216. We also have the 1080, which is half, and we have the quotient of 216, which is 6 times 6 times 6. They knew that. That's not in the Bible by chance. They knew that. That is in relationship to the sacred marriage of opposites of the sun and the earth mother. You're familiar with 666 in the Bible, meaning the devil. However, if you read the quote, it says, "Let he who hath understanding count the number, for the number of man as 606. So let's think of who was persecuting the Christians. It was the Romans. So let's understand that it was the Romans that were persecuting the Christians, and now let's count the Roman numerical system of 500, 150, 10, 5, and 1, and we get a total of 666. So 666 is in reference to the devil, it's in reference to Rome. Because we know, even in the Bible, that 666 meant the sun. We know that from Chronicles, where they bring Solomon 600 threescore talents of gold as a tribute number. And if we look at the name Solomon itself, Sol is Latin for sun, Am is Hindi for sun, and An is Egyptian for sun. Solomon means sun, sun, sun. We could further take that in taking the O's, which is the 15th letter of the Greek alphabet, drop that O down 3 times 15, 15, 15, which could be an anagram for 1 plus 5, 1 plus 5, 1 plus 5, or the name Solomon itself means 666. In Ezra, the children of Adonakam, who were escaping Nebuchadnezzar, had 666 people with them. Adonakam is in reference to the Phoenician god Adonis, who is a sun god. So again, we have the sun being attached to the number 666. Now, let's take a quick look at this in the Ohio Valley. This is Charleston, West Virginia. We have 2 hinges, both of which are 666 feet in circumference, being associated with the sun. Sometimes being a base 6 numerical system, which we still base our clocks on, we base our calendars from, all that having its roots in ancient Babylon. I'm sorry this did not come out. But each one of these hinges is 210 feet. 210 times pi is 660. This one here is 240 feet. But it's a number that's going to repeat itself continuously through the Ohio Valley. We're either going to have 666 or 660 in most of the hinges. As far as the Earth Mother goes, we're going to see plenty of 1080s. This is the graded way at Piketon, which is 1,080 feet long. And then attached to that is a set of earthworks. So the graded way is over here, but here we have 420 and 240, so we have a 660. But if we add 420, 420, and 240, we get 1080. And this 212 right here, 212 times pi is 666. So we can pull all three numbers out of this particular earthwork. Over in Hopeton, at Chillicothe, Ohio, we know that they had learned how to square a circle because this circle is 20 acres and the square is 20 acres, and so squaring a circle is not easy. That's high mathematics, but there's several cases in the Ohio Valley where they did it. This circle is 1,050 feet in diameter, and 1,050 is 210 times 5. So it's an expression of the 210 in a little bit larger form. And in the context of squaring a circle. Also around Chillicothe are plenty of these earthworks. These isn't real clear, but each one of the sides of the square is 1,080 feet. And we see it repeating itself. One of the most, some of the best evidence is in Winchester, Indiana. Here we have an east-west wall, 1,320 feet, that's 660 times 2. And here on the north-south walls, we have 1080. But if we have 1080s together, we got a 2160, and then we have the 660s here on the north. So we can pull a 2160 or a 666, and that balance. And hopefully lost a square. Oh, here we go. Now, just a few miles from the Winchester earthwork is Fountain City. It's just about 5 miles away. Now, this was 780 foot on each side. And if you take the 1320 of Winchester and subtract the 780, you get 540. So if we add all four sides of the difference, again, we're going to get 2160. So the Winchester works and the Fountain City work were made to be numerically harmonic. And then finally, to prove the point, in Lexington, Kentucky, and there's 3 others, this earthwork, this hinge, is 555 feet in circumference. And 555 is an important number because 555 times pi is 1746, or the sum total of 666 plus 1080. The gateway to this and many of the earthworks in the Ohio Valley is 33 feet. 33 is the square root of 1080. Of course, we know in the Bible, Christ is crucified at 33. Christ is the gateway. The gateway is 33.